Welcome to everyone who's joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute. We are so excited for this workshop, and welcome to another Stormwater Awareness Week Day 3 workshop. We're so happy to have you here. As always, these are being recorded and you'll be able to watch it on our website, which is stormwaterawareness.org. I'm going to hand it over to Tom and let him introduce himself and get started on his presentation. So Tom, thank you so much for being willing to present today.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. We appreciate it. And I told Rebecca to just go ahead and as questions, if there's questions in the chat, we can just go ahead and we can jump on those questions as we're moving along. And so don't feel like you have to wait to the end if you have a question as I'm getting into this presentation. But we're going to talk a little bit about improving wetland plant establishment and long-term survival in stormwater control measures. So my name is Tom Polero. I manage the our client services and sort of sales team at Dragonfly Pondworks. I will just a quick, I'll tell you a little bit about Dragonfly, but a quick overview of the presentation is a quick overview of who we are. Very briefly go over that and then talk about the importance of plants, why we have plants in a lot of these stormwater control measures. And then the kind of the key parts of the presentation, you know, what leads to the greatest success, at least in my experience, is we'll talk about soil planting and soil and planting preparation. We're going to talk about water level management, wildlife and damage that can be caused by wildlife, the importance of maintenance after installation, and then any time for any questions. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end or as we go. So just briefly, Dragonfly, we've been around since 2006. We are a specialized stormwater vendor, stormwater contractor. So we pretty much work just on stormwater, although we do get into a little bit of lake and farm pond work. Our bread and butter is really stormwater and specializing in stormwater. We're headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina. And we pretty much serve Pennsylvania down into Florida and a few locations west towards the Mississippi. We're about 200 employees, plus or minus. But we will work a lot with commercial properties, municipalities, as well as large HOAs. That's kind of our target client base, and then we provide all aspects of stormwater maintenance, inspection, repairs, reconstruction, conversions, pretty much anything stormwater related. That's going to be one of our core services. So, and I have been with this company since 2006. Before that, I studied stormwater ponds, not really working on them per se, but studying pollutant removal efficiency. I was working at a lab down in Charleston, South Carolina, for the National Ocean Service. We were sort of studying the impact of ponds on coastal water quality, and then moved to Raleigh in 2008 and started with Dragonfly. So, I'm a biologist sort of by training, although I'm technically considered sales now. I don't have any really sales training, so I'm a stormwater guy, biologist nerd. So starting with kind of the beginning is, you know, why do we have plants? Plants are there for a reason, and you know, our clients, they don't make any money by spending money on their stormwater control measures, and you know, we work a lot with some of the big box stores and some apartment chains and those sorts of things, and you know, they're not making money off of spending money on their ponds. They just don't. So a lot of times we have to educate them on, you know, they might lose plants due to a drought or one of a myriad of different reasons, and explaining to them why they have to do a expensive replanting job. It requires a little bit of education, that these plants are not there, although they can be aesthetically pleasing. They're not there because they look pretty necessarily. They're there for functional reasons. They're part of the design plan of these stormwater control measures. Nutrient uptake, that's a big one. Shoreline stabilization, the pictures on the bottom, you can sort of see that root material, once it kind of gets in there and establishes, it really helps protect the shoreline from things like erosion, escarpment, and that sort of thing. And then it creates a nice little habitat for beneficial aquatic organisms and insects, such as the dragonfly. You can have a nice population of dragonflies in your stormwater wetland, and you might notice a reduction in mosquitoes. Dragonflies are known to be pretty voracious predators of mosquitoes. In addition to dragonflies, it's just plants make nice little microhabitats for all sorts of aquatic organisms, fish, beneficial insects, and that sort of thing. So starting with that, we have these plants there for a reason. When done well, when maintained, they can also look aesthetically pleasing. But going back to talking to folks that are facing a new install or a replanting job for whatever reason, we start with that these plants are part of the design of these basins. They can be nice to look at, but they're there for functional reasons that we just went over. And so this I just show you is a typical planting plan. Most of y'all, if you work in the stormwater space, you've probably seen this. It's basically a layout of where they want the wetland plants to go in the different zones. On the bottom left, there's sorry for the low resolution imagery, but it's basically a list of the plants by common name, scientific name, quantity. And so this is what we give to our crews. This is what is given to us by clients when it's time to replant. This is done at the design level when the site civil work is being done. And so an engineer is typically creating this plant layout. So just a typical planting plan with layout. And so we talked about some of the keys, is preparation before planting. I just show here where it's calling out 4 inches of topsoil to be added prior to planting. That's a thing that in our area, we see that sometimes kind of gets skipped over. Depends on the municipality and the level of sort of oversight. But adding topsoil is not cheap. And so it's one of those things that some folks will kind of try to slide on it. We found much better outcomes when you actually add that topsoil for a variety of reasons. We'll get into, how it can quickly become fairly complex and expensive. But this is just an example that it is something that's often called out on plans, is to add a topsoil layer in preparation for planting. But this is what that looks like. So this is a very large constructed wetland in Durham, North Carolina. You can see we have a 80,000-pound excavator and a track dump machine. So we were moving a significant quantity of topsoil out into this wetland because this particular client, I think, not at this location, but at another location, had some poor results with a wetland, had some plant failures, very poor establishment. And so they said, we're going to do this one kind of by the book, by the plans. And so that included this, I believe this called out a 6-inch topsoil layer, but it's expensive. And so that's why it gets skipped over a lot. In this case, we had, multiple pieces of heavy equipment to move this soil out into the middle of the pond. So you can see how the cost can get up there quickly with labor and equipment. But when done this way, we see much better outcomes. When a retention pond is being installed as a sediment basin or being converted, you have heavy equipment, compaction, especially on the dam. You're going to have a lot of heavily compacted soils, especially in our neck of the woods where you have a lot of clay based soils. And so it's not really conducive to plant establishment trying to go and plant into this rock hard soil. So bringing in the topsoil, doing some tilling and some loosening of that upper 4 to 6 inches can really make a difference. And so we push for that, but not everybody is willing to or able to do it due to sometimes getting into cost restraints. But again, loosening the soil, so you can see this particular planting plan had called out for several gallon pots. And so we, in addition to, for these larger plants, we came in with an auger bit. So we're really getting in there and loosening up the upper soil upper layer of the soil, just to give these plant roots a chance to kind of spread and become established and do their thing. If we were just to go in and use a spade and jam these plants in, they're probably not going to do very well. So going through and doing this level of preparation is really important step with cost associated with it. So the education component is really key here when walking someone through one of these proposals. And I just have a note about sourcing quality material. We work with several vendors across the region that we can just count on them for quality material, quality plants. They won't release the plants to us in the springtime until they're ready to go. And so just having a good network of plant providers is really key as well in terms of the preparation and kind of the front end side of things. And so you've done your soil prep, you've scarified or loosened up the top foot of soil, you've brought in your 6-inch topsoil layer. And so then it sort of becomes about water level management. This is probably, I would say in my experience doing this for 15 years or so, water level management is probably the key component to getting good plant establishment. And the key is sort of, these wetland plants, right? They can handle being completely inundated and flooded for extended periods of time, but just not in that first year immediately after planting. That's when they like, I say, saturation versus inundation. So they want to have wet feet. They want to have a couple of inches of water, but they don't necessarily want to be completely submerged. And so coming up with clever ways to passively manage your water level is going to be really, really beneficial. Like I said, a lot of the wetland plans will call out a 6 to 8 inch shallow water zone. But I found in that first growing season, it's much more beneficial if you can keep that closer to the 2 to 3 inch range. Keep that soil soggy and saturated and wet, but not too deep, so that the plants are going to be flooded. And the design cross section on the bottom just sort of shows a really nice design that allows for basically passive dewatering of this basin while the plants are getting established. In the old days, we used to go out there and chase after the valve. We would open the valve a little bit and then it would go through a dry period, and so we'd have to go close the valve, and then we get a bunch of rain and have to go back and open the valve. But this little berm that you see right here in front of the outlet control structure was essentially establishing a really nice 2 to 3 inch. It was kind of serving to reset the water level with the valve open, so that you would have that 2 to 3 inch depth of water throughout the basin, and especially in the shallow water areas. So we could have the valve wide open. We could have big rainstorms. This thing would passively dewater within a day or two back to that kind of sweet spot. That just a couple inches of water there. Like I said, these small plugs and even some 4-inch plants, they're going to do much better that first year in those saturated soils, as opposed to full on, 6 to 12 inch depth. So, and this is just an example of that. So this cross-sectional view on the bottom left is essentially what the outlet control structure, how it had been designed, and the grading work that had been included for this stormwater wetland, which is in Raleigh, North Carolina. But we did all the things here. We had a really nice outlet control structure that allowed for passive dewatering to that sweet spot. You can see the picture on the left that's with the valve wide open. We have water in the deep pools, and you can see most of those areas are nice and wet. The soil is muddy, or the soil is saturated, and a good moisture content for those wetland plants. They just love this. And you can in fact see on the right, that's the same angle. That's the same growing season. So that is the plants on the left went in, I believe, in late March or early April, and by the time we had mid to late summer, they just took off. We had topsoil. Again, the keys there were the soil prep, the water level, and the topsoil. And the plants really flourished in that first growing season. So we also had maintenance out there, which we'll touch on that a little bit here as we continue on. So another sort of little method that we came across to sort of, again, getting back into the key of water level management. How can we passively manage this water level so that the plants are not flooded in that first year, but so that they have enough water to be wet and not get too dry. And a lot of that comes from a temporary modification of the outlet control structure. By installing the orifice elevation slightly below the plan design, you can control with that PVC. You see this little white PVC elbow. We call that a turn up or an adjustable siphon, but you can essentially look at that as almost like a fine tune of your water level. So you can install it below the final permanent pool depth, and then by adjusting the height and the angle of the PVC pipe, you can control your water level. So while you're in that first season, having it turned, we have it turned to dewater to, again, that 2-inch depth. And then we know that once those plants have established and taken root, after that first growing season, we can just go ahead and turn that adjustable orifice back up to the design depth, design elevation, so that we're compliant with the plans and matching the plans. Pretty cool. For those of you many of you may be familiar with this and using this. If not, it's a pretty cool element for this reason. For any sort of fine tuning water level control, it's a nice little trick to be able to adjust that water level. So we're doing this a lot, and this has been really in problematic wetlands. This kind of is a when we're going back into a pond where this hasn't been called out, it's usually because we've tried a lot of other things and we just can't get it to take. So this is an example of that. This was an older basin behind an old shopping center in Raleigh, a fairly large constructed wetland, but heavily impacted by geese. Very flashy system. So a little rainstorm would cause this thing to fill up very quickly. It actually has two outlet control structures. You can see the one at the back, and there's one off to the right-hand side, but multiple planting attempts failed. The geese got in here. Like I said, it was really flashy. This kind of goes back to the beginning where before we kind of had the idea of going and busting a temporary hole in the riser. We tried a lot of different things, but eventually we came in and installed, we basically came in with a core drill and dropped the orifice elevation about 6 inches and ended up using the turn up method to be able to passively dewater this thing. And what do you know? We get plants. This was one of my first wetland jobs. It was very challenging, but again, and this was an older one. The topsoil, the soils were nice and soft. There was really no tilling of soil needed, no import of topsoil. It was very nutrient rich soil. You could step into it and sort of sink up to your ankles. That's usually a pretty good sign for wetland plants and their likelihood of success. But just by managing the water level, by a temporary modification of the outlet control structure, we were able to get good establishment at this wetland. So you've noticed in a lot of these, this fencing, either orange fencing or green fencing, and that is essentially a goose exclusion fence or a wildlife exclusion fence. In our area, we have the Canada goose is lovely animal, but it's not your friend when you are trying to establish tender wetland vegetation in the springtime and in the coastal southeast. The geese will just come in and hammer your plants, your 2-inch plugs. They just love to snack on those. And so making sure that when you're going to spend sometimes $15, $20, $30,000 on a replanting job, let's go ahead and put in a temporary fence. This is just a green netting material purchased at any kind of home supply store, T-posts, zip ties, and then monofilament line across a zigzag across the top with different flagging, and that really can help deter the geese. You have to be pretty vigilant about this fence and securing it in all angles. If they find one little weak link in the fence, they will exploit it. So they making sure you're vigilant about keeping your fence intact, not hitting it with the weed eaters and creating holes in places where the geese can penetrate. But this is really, if you're going to spend big bucks on a replant, let's go ahead and put a temporary fence in. This can come out after usually 1 or 2 growing seasons at the most, and it's a couple $1,000 type deal depending on the size of the pond, and definitely worth the investment. But got to watch out for geese. They will hammer your young wetland vegetation.
We have a question that's related to this topic. What design aspects cover pest control for these projects? So you talked a little bit about geese. What about other pests?
Yeah. Did you have another pest in mind? Are you thinking about turtles?
Let's see if they respond to the chat. Mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes. Yeah. So with mosquitoes, again, that's a good question. And that kind of goes back to, by the time this is in our hands, we're not a design firm. We're essentially just the contractor. So we will sometimes ask for small variations to the planting plan. But in general, we're essentially just implementing what's been designed by others. But if you can get a nice vegetated buffer, densely vegetated littoral shelf with things like pickerelweed and that, you're going to create a beneficial habitat and draw in a lot of things like dragonflies. And that's the biggest thing we've seen, is by creating that sort of habitat for things like dragonflies, as opposed to something like a cattail, the cattail's kind of growth and death cycle seems to be, at least it's thought to be more of a promoter of mosquito breeding, whereas having things like pickerelweed and other plants like that can actually create more of a beneficial habitat. And it's crazy if you look it up, and I don't go into it in this presentation, but I urge you to spend a couple minutes online searching mosquito predation or dragonfly predation of mosquitoes, especially on YouTube. There's some really cool pictures and videos, high-res videos of dragonflies consuming mosquito larvae. So it's a real thing. But did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Were there any other questions?
We do have some. Would you like those now, or do you want to answer these at the end?
It's up to you. I can keep going if you want.
Yeah, let's keep going because you might answer some of them.
Okay. So the fencing, that's key. It's fairly inexpensive and can be removed. And then this is sort of, in doing this for a long time, people say, well, how do I get rid of my geese? Does this work? Do the coyote silhouette cutouts work? Do flashing lights work? There's a material you can spray on the grass that's supposed to make them sick. Talking about fencing, which can work, but one of the things that I've heard works, pretty is maybe the best goose deterrent solution is using dogs. So there are services out there like Goose Busters and Geese Police. They have these very, very well trained, quite expensive. I've found out border collies that they will bring to the ponds at randomized times. And essentially, eventually, the geese will start to associate those locations with predators, and they will start to steer clear of those particular lakes. But again, with like everything that we've talked about so far, there's a cost associated here. It's probably the most expensive of all the solutions, but it does really work. So if you're having issues with geese and you just can't get rid of them, or you need them off your site, I would highly encourage you to have some discussions with a local um, somebody that has a goose dog company in your area. And then the kind of the last piece is maintenance after installation. There's nothing worse than seeing somebody, spend $30,000 on a replanting and just not, for whatever reason, not do any maintenance. It's amazing how quickly these ponds will revert back into the nuisance. Unwanted vegetation can creep back in, things like cattails and willows and things like that. With just a little bit of a lapse in maintenance, you can quickly lose your beneficials. And so having that maintenance start, and we really encourage you to work with a specialized pond contractor on this. But having that maintenance start immediately after planting is just really key. Not only can you stay on top of the nuisance invasives through either hand pulling, wiping, cutting, but you can also be out, you're on site regularly, right? So we have kayaks in our trucks. This technician in the middle is out there removing some debris from a trash rack on an outlet control structure. Another reason to do the maintenance is that you could put these plants in and everything is looking great, but then you have a massive rainstorm and a bunch of, like this, in this case, a bunch of algae washes in and clogs up your outlet control structure. Your pond becomes flooded, and you potentially lose those little baby plugs that you've just installed. So having some sort of regular maintenance program in place immediately after installation is highly recommended to sort of protect your investment. Again, for not only for things like water level, but also for controlling invasives such as cattails and other invasive plants. And then this is just sort of one case study of what that can kind of look like. This is a large wetland in Charlotte, North Carolina, that they had sort of deferred maintenance on it. I think they had their site maintenance guy that's like, they sort of dumped the ponds in his bucket and said, you're in charge of the ponds, or maybe it was the landscaper, but nonetheless, you can see on the left, this thing reverted to all cattails and primrose. It was full of what we would consider nuisance vegetation, and none of the wetland plants were really there or identifiable. And so, yeah, they just by not spending what we would consider, relative to the cost of the cleanup and removal, it's a small dollar figure to just be out here maintaining this pond on a monthly basis and staying on top of the unwanted vegetation. You avoid this big expensive, because once it goes to this, you have to dig up the cattail roots. There's really no other way around it. You have to come in and essentially take out the entire plant. And so it's costly, it's labor intensive, it's time consuming, and it also involves equipment, hauling, disposal, that sort of thing. So, a little bit of maintenance goes a long way. A routine maintenance program would have probably avoided, most of this situation. So, always do some sort of maintenance, and really urge you to work, the temptation might be to work with your landscaper or some other, or lower priced contractor, but really urge you to, if you're going to do that, definitely interview them and grill them on, have they done this sort of work? Do they have the proper certifications? in most cases, again, we see better outcomes when folks decide to partner with specialized stormwater contractors. And then just a few other considerations. Pick the winners. Having some flex, and most municipalities are great about this. We may ask for suitable modifications to the planting plan. There, a lot of times the planting plans may be done by PEs that haven't actually seen the plants perform or see how they do in the field. They might just be picking off a list of approved plants for zone 1 or zone 2 or zone 3. And so, but whereas, we know from experience that there's maybe a dozen or so that are just going to be that they're kind of the tried and true winners. Your pickerel weeds, your rushes, your soft rush, your soft stem bulrush. I'm using the common names, but things like duck potato and blue flag iris. Those are plants that we know will, if you get the other stuff right, they have a really good likelihood of survival. And whereas some things, I always pick on cardinal flower, but we see things like cardinal flower called out often. And I just have rarely seen that establish and flourish. So pick the winners, go with the ones that are going to be robust and survive in most situations that you've had success with in the past. And it just ties into the second bullet point, allow for, as a municipal inspector, allow for reasonable substitutions and flexibility in the planting plan. And then just be willing to explore alternate approaches such as temporary riser modifications. And then the last thing is just expectations with our clients. Is that, this can be a multi-year sort of a multi-year endeavor. Even if you get most things right, we could have an extreme drought, or the geese could find a weak spot in your fence. We could have a variety of different things, and that may not cause you to have a complete loss of your plants, but to maybe get to full 60-70% coverage. This might be a 2 to 3 year plan, right? Where you might have to supplement some plants that are lost for whatever reason. So setting that expectation with clients, that it's not just a one and done kind of throw them in and forget about it. Do the prep on the front end, use the right plants, and then implement a maintenance program. And in most cases, that's going to lead you to have good outcomes. All right. Well, we got 30 minutes. I knew I wasn't going to fill an hour. I apologize, but sounds like we might have a few questions, so we have time for that.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for listening.
We have a few questions. First one that I'm curious about before I get into the chat is, how do wetlands like these winter over for areas that get a little cold? Is that a concern? Can you just walk through it? Because I know we have a lot of attendees from different areas across the country where everyone has a little bit different climate.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and we go through, so Raleigh we have 4 seasons here, winter, spring, summer, fall, and a lot of the plants that they will go dormant in the wintertime. Something like a pickerel weed, for example, I'll use that just because that's one of my favorites. It blooms because it blooms for so long. I mean, I've seen it bloom from April through September, these really nice purple stalks. But then come October, it starts to go dormant. The above ground biomass, turns brown and just sort of lays dormant. Breaks down. A lot of it tends to kind of break down over the wintertime. And then come springtime, the new shoots come up and the cycle starts all over again. So in some cases, we'll do some deadheading, some cutting and removal of that material if it's needed. But we found if we've kept the if we've kept the plants maintained over the course of the year, that's usually not needed.
Okay. So let's take our first question in the chat. Do you ever use seeds instead of plant plugs? That's hard to say. Do you ever use seeds instead of plant plugs?
That's a good question. So we have used a riparian mix, or what sometimes they'll call it a wetland seed mix. Mixed results on that. It's tough because it's with the plugs or these the 4-inch pots, you can tell where you've put things, and you know what not to weed eat or what not to mow. We have done some jobs where we've used a wetland seed mix. It's just sort of had mixed results. I haven't seen it where it's hard to tell how well it's actually doing, just because it's growing in and among a lot of the other natural vegetation that's in there. But these things do exist. They're quite expensive, but I think they can work in the right environments.
Okay, next question. What sort of testing is done to ensure adequate soil quality for a wetland project, i.e. gradation, plasticity index, organic content, nutrients of interest?
So we don't find it, in my experience, that level of, at least for a wetland. Now, if you're talking about bioretention, that's a different ballgame. But for wetlands, we don't find a lot of detailed specifications other than just a topsoil. So they'll typically call for topsoil, which has good organic material, usually a good dark color to it. But we don't typically have I haven't seen a lot of real tight specifications on the topsoil and specifics about what it needs to what the specifications need to be, other than a nice, loose, fluffy topsoil.
Okay. The next one is, should you design the wetland so it is only about 2 to 3 inches deep?
Yeah, I don't think that you'll be able to get away with changing the design and the fact that the shallow water zone is going to be somewhere between 6 to usually 12 inches. I don't know. I'm not a designer, but I think that the take home from this presentation was, if you can accomplish that for a temporary time during early plant establishment, that was kind of the message there. If you can have those shallow water zones that are called out, for the life of the pond to be 6 inches deep, but just for that first year, if you can keep them a little shallower, and let those plants get established, then I think 6 inches is fine. So I'm not necessarily advocating for a change in the design spec, more of just a temporary kind of trick of the trade to help with establishment.
Awesome. And the next question is, I have heard that certain water plants have the ability to uptake certain toxics or pollutants, aka phytoremediation. If we have certain pollutants of concern, how should we approach plant selection?
That is a great question, and unfortunately, it's not one that I can speak to intelligently. I know that this is an emerging thing. Well, not even necessarily emerging, but I know that there are plants that can take up certain toxins. Unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise. But I think it's really cool technology, and I know that it exists. Unfortunately, I cannot speak to it in this context. I apologize.
Okay. And then we had a question about if mosquito fish are a viable option for wetlands.
Yeah, absolutely. Generally we're seeing deep pools in wetlands. So usually 2 to 3 foot depth, in multiple pools throughout the wetland. So we've definitely stocked mosquito fish into constructed wetlands. Yeah, that's definitely a good viable option if you've got mosquito issues. one of the things we do remind folks is everybody, well, not everybody, but we do get calls and say, we have mosquitoes. We want you to come look at the pond. And occasionally it's the pond, but typically, like in this picture, I don't know if my presentation is still showing, but in the lake that he's standing in front of, a body of water that big is probably not going to be a net exporter of mosquitoes, only because it's so large, right? There's so many different predators of mosquitoes in that body of water. The stormwater retention ponds tend to get blamed for creating mosquito problems, but I would almost I would argue that let's do a more thorough inspection of the adjacent areas and see, do we have somebody that's got a wheelbarrow that's full of water, buckets of half full water in their backyard, or gutters that aren't being properly maintained, or the one I've seen was one of those above ground swimming pools that's 3 or 4 feet deep that had 2 inches of water and full of leaves. Those are going to be your mosquito producing areas, more so than your pond in a lot of cases. So I'm not saying ponds can't produce mosquitoes, but they're often doing so in combination with other factors at any given site.
Okay. We have a question here about how often you would recommend ponds and other plants to be maintained.
So typically, I would say, let's say you're doing let's say it is just a stormwater pond with a littoral, with a vegetative buffer. We found that a quarterly program kind of works good. We call it quarterly, but it's really a 4 visits kind of throughout the growing season. So like April, June, August, October kind of thing. Coming in, and that, not only taking care of these nuisance invasives that might be starting to pop up, but you can top the plants. We teach our guys that these areas can have a kind of a natural but maintained look. So usually about 4 times a year, especially if aesthetics are important to you, that's kind of a minimum we would typically recommend.
Okay, and a question that goes hand in hand with that is, what tends to be forgotten during maintenance?
Forgotten during maintenance. Again, it just depends who you're working with. If you're working with a specialized contractor, they should have their folks trained up to be able to, every time they're going to your site, they should be going down the checklist that your municipality is using, that your municipality would use to inspect your site. If you have inspection requirements where in your municipality. So for your specialized pond companies, they should be getting trained in all those key maintenance tasks. We have our guys take a look at all the structures and photograph all the structures and create these nice little PDF maintenance logs that show pictures of the outlet and the inlet inflow pipes, the dissipator pads, just to show that, hey, we were out here in April and these things are in good condition. Or we can show you a photo of, hey, there's a problem starting here. Let's talk about it, or let's maybe try to fix something now earlier before it becomes a much more expensive problem. Yeah, the pond companies are usually pretty good. What we see by when you have some non-specialized contractors, you see a lot of over mowing. You see a lot of mowing, scalping of side slopes, but also mowing of beneficial or treating chemical application to these beneficial plants. That's kind of one of the pitfalls and one of the reasons that we encourage folks to work with pond contractors. We end up unfortunately getting a lot of calls to come in to replant after plants have been after beneficial plants have been cut or sprayed. But other than that, and the other thing too, I'd say, again, kind of getting out of wetland management, but just with ponds in general, making sure that you're maintaining the top, the back, and the front, the top, and the back of the dam. The back of the dam is probably the thing that gets missed the most when mowing is being done by typically landscapers. Not picking on landscapers, they're really good at what they do. But in terms of the question was what gets missed. We see the mowing of the back of the dam typically get missed, and eventually woody vegetation starts to pop up, and then rather than being able to run a mower over it, now you have to use some sort of a bush hog, and it just becomes more costly.
Okay, then we have a question. Does your group ever get into needing permits from the Army Corps of Engineers, or is that a designer or developer responsibilities? Wetlands tied to waters of the state are still protected.
Yeah, so the stuff that we showed in this presentation, these were all permitted stormwater devices. And so the activities that we are doing here are considered maintenance. But certainly we get into situations like more like dredging where we typically would partner up with a professional engineer to handle the permitting side of things. That's not really our strong suit. And so in situations where permits are needed, we'll typically partner up with a PE that sort of specializes in navigating that process. So that's typically how that gets handled.
Okay, and here's a good question. If it takes a year or two to establish the plants at a low water level, what do you do with the extra water until it is established?
Um, well, essentially, you're just releasing that water downstream. And so instead of having essentially think about it, instead of having let's say your pond is supposed to be 1 foot deep, essentially all you're doing is modifying that riser structure so that it's 2 inches deep. And so it's just additional drainage moving kind of through the system on downstream. And it's just a temporary adjustment of the height of the permanent pool. So the water is just released as it would be if the pond were built to spec. I don't know if that's confusing, but hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, then we have another one. What role can public education and community involvement play in the success of wetlands used for stormwater management?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you can see on this one, there's some signage. So on the picture next to the guy with the hedge clippers on the right, we have some signage. So using small signage, no mow signs, signs that say what kind of plants they are and why they're there. Talking to folks, this is a functional component of this pond. These plants are here because they're performing a function, and describing a little bit about what those functions are. I think that's a great little educational tool, just some pond side signage. Yeah. That's something that we've used in the past.
Okay,
Does that answer the question?
I think so. How would you best recommend removal of algae? I know there are herbicides that can be used, but in order to protect the plants in their first year, would it be better to devote full time to physical removal?
Yeah, the physical removal can be tough, but it's probably good to our best practice is let's go ahead and get the algae taken care of before we come in and plant if we have an algae issue. Unfortunately, yeah, you might get into some situations where you have to use some nets or some rakes to get it out of there. But if we can get it under control before we go in and plant, then that's usually an ideal kind of order of operations. Take care of get the nuisance stuff out of there, and then let's go ahead and go in with the beneficial plants.
Do you consider use of fertilizers for plant establishment? If so, how do you control nutrient runoff into the water and fluctuating water nutrient concentrations?
Yeah, so that's another good one. Um, we've never, I don't think we've ever fertilized the actual wetland plants. Um, like I said, when you do the topsoil, when you do the loosening of the and the tilling, and the decompaction, I guess, for lack of a better term, and you get the water level right, these little guys will take off. Um, where we do sometimes get into fertilization is, and it's typically given as a kind of a one-time thing, a one-time fertilization of typically the side slopes and the dam where, again, we talked about compaction. You've had this heavy equipment tracking in and out, and the side slopes and dam are really, really, really compacted. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but the reality is that a lot of the municipalities want to see a nice vegetated basin. And so a lot of them will allow a one-time lime and fertilizer application to, but typically we'll get a soil test done through the extension service. We'll figure out what rates of lime, what rates of fertilizer it needs, and then, applying it responsibly as a one-time thing is, it seems it's a little bit counterintuitive, but at the end of the day, we've got to get some grass established on these side slopes. And so, as a one-time thing, kind of cost benefit of constantly dealing with bare soil and erosion, or doing a one-time fertilizer application and getting some good turf establishment. That's usually where we end up going. But like I said, if we do the things that we sort of laid out in the presentation, we don't find the need to fertilize the actual wetland plants.
Okay, you touched a little bit on this during the presentation, but we'll go over this question again for more details. But do wetlands or ponds ever need water added or pumped in during dry seasons?
They shouldn't, but and that's a not really a good sustainable situation. If that's the case, that's indicative to me that there's a need for some geotechnical work. Do we have bedrock? Do we have, we have some ponds up in the western part of our state around Asheville that the water just sort of infiltrates down into groundwater. So coming in with some requiring some sort of a clay liner or a rubber liner is called out in a lot of cases. But yeah, typically if your pond is not holding a full pool, that's indicative of a leak somewhere, in most cases, unless it's a really, really, really small pond or a very severe drought. So we don't typically get into situations where we're pumping water in.
Okay, speaking of pumping water, moving water around, we have a question about when moving water downstream due to a year of establishment. I imagine that downstream creeks and other water bodies need to be stabilized to control excess direct flows. Do you recommend partnering with individuals with stream bank stabilization to prevent negative downstream effects?
Yeah, it's always good to be cognizant of what's going on downstream. However, I think the processes and the process that I've kind of described here, you're not really going to be dealing with a monster release of high velocity flow downstream. Typically, if we're able to use the adjustment of the orifice elevation, then you're still going to be releasing, and the orifice diameter is called out to be 4 inches. You're still going to be releasing that water through a 4-inch diameter pipe. So again, while it is good to be cognizant of what's going on downstream, I don't think any of the methods described herein would be contributing necessarily negatively in the form of high flow, high energy, high turbidity water. It's all just coming through the drawdown orifice, which is installed at design specification. So.
Okay, one more question before we need to wrap up. I know you touched on this a little bit too during the presentation, but in the beginning stages of tilling and prepping the soil, Do you ever need to amend the soil and add nutrients or possibly compost to ensure plant establishment?
Yeah, that can go kind of hand in hand with topsoil. If let's say, and that's a great question. Let's say you can't get for access reasons, you can't, and you're calling out that you need 2,000 cubic yards of topsoil and you can't get that quantity in there because of access restrictions, let's say. You could definitely come in with a compost and assuming that you've got marginally decent soil, some clay, you can till that in there. We have a couple different pieces of equipment that will allow us to do some aeration and tilling and mix it in there. So you get that organic material and really that loosening of that upper section of the soil. And then a lot of times that'll accomplish the same thing or very similar results to adding a full layer of topsoil on there.
Fantastic. Well, that looks like that's all the questions in the chat. And thank you, Tom, so much for your presentation. There's a lot of great information there. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And if you missed any portion of this workshop, it was recorded and you'll be able to find it on our website in about 24 hours. And the website is stormwaterawareness.org. Also, be sure to check out, we got 3 more workshops for today. There's one starting in about 5 minutes coming from the city of Calgary about their stormwater program. Even if you don't live in Canada, sometimes it's fun to hear what other people are doing and their success stories. So be sure to join that workshop in about 5 minutes. And then we have one on site stabilization, final coverage, and notice of termination, and as well as one with Caltrans and the 2022 CGP specific changes. So we got 3 more workshops for today. And then we got 2 more days coming up with stormwater information. So head over to our website to see all those workshops. But thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for attending.
Does everybody, Rebecca, will people have a way to get a hold of me if they have any further questions? Is that information out there? Or you can see my email is tom@dragonfly if you have any questions or want to go into anything with further detail.
Yeah, if you have any questions, people, take a screenshot,
check us out.
Take a picture, look up their website. They're also on social media. So Be sure to check out all the fantastic work that they're doing.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for attending. I really appreciate it.
All right. See you at the next workshop.
Take care.